The great crystal hall stretched for miles in every direction, its walls pulsing with soft blue light that seemed to breathe with the rhythm of a dying galaxy. 12 different species sat around the massive circular table, each representative, looking more desperate than the last. The air hummed with tension as translators worked overtime to convert clicks, whistles, mental waves, and chemical signals into something resembling unified communication. Ambassador Zethkri of the Altarian Republic stood on his 4 insect-like legs, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh reality displayed on the holographic screens around them. His mandibles clicked nervously as he spoke, the sound echoing through translation devices worn by every delegate present. The numbers on the screens told a story that none of them wanted to believe, but all of them had to face. 17 systems have fallen in the last solar cycle, Zethkri announced, his voice carrying the weight of billions of lost lives. The Vorthak Empire advances faster than our most pessimistic projections suggested. Their quantum-shielded dreadnoughts cut through our combined fleets like they were made of paper. Elder Moonwhisper, the ancient tree-like being representing the Sylvan Collective, swayed her massive trunk body in what her species called the gesture of deep sorrow. Her bark-covered skin showed scars from countless years of growth and wisdom, but even her millennium of experience offered no solutions to their current crisis. When she spoke, her voice came through root-like appendages that touched the translation matrix built into the table. "We have thrown everything we have at them," she said, her words carrying the sound of wind through ancient forests. "Our most advanced plasma cannons barely scratch their hulls. Our quantum torpedoes detonate harmlessly against their shields. Even our psychic warriors cannot penetrate their mental defenses." Counselor Veltar of the Centauri Federation shifted uncomfortably in his floating chair, his blue-scaled skin changing colors as his emotions fluctuated. As one of the youngest species in the Council, the Centaurians had always prided themselves on their advanced technology and superior intellect. Now that same pride felt like ash in his mouth as he reviewed the tactical reports. "Their ships are larger, faster, and more heavily armed than anything we have ever encountered," Veltar added, his voice barely above a whisper. "But worse than that, they fight with a coordination and efficiency that defies our understanding. Every move is calculated, every strategy optimized for maximum destruction with minimum loss." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft humming of the translation devices and the distant sound of space traffic outside the station. Each representative stared at the holographic displays, showing red markers advancing steadily across the galactic map. Systems that had stood for thousands of years were being consumed one by one, their populations either enslaved or eliminated entirely. Admiral Corthan of the Rigelian Defense Corps slammed one of his 6 arms against the table, causing several smaller delegates to jump in their seats. His warrior race had never backed down from a fight, but even they had been forced to retreat after losing 3 entire battle groups to a single Vorthak assault force. "We cannot simply wait for them to reach our core worlds," he growled through his translation collar. "There must be something we have not tried, some weapon or strategy we have overlooked." It was then that Counselor Veltar made the suggestion that would change the course of galactic history. His blue scales had settled into a deep purple color that indicated deep thought mixed with desperate hope. When he spoke, his words were careful and measured, as if he himself could not quite believe what he was proposing. "There is one species we have not yet approached," he said slowly. "The humans of the Sol system. They achieved faster than light, travel only recently, and their technology is primitive by our standards, but their military history suggests certain capabilities that might prove useful." The reaction was immediate and varied. Several delegates began speaking at once, their translation devices creating a cacophony of overlapping voices. Some expressed disbelief that such a primitive species could offer any assistance. Others worried about the ethics of involving a barely spacefaring civilization in an interstellar war. Zethkri raised one of his clawed hands for silence, his compound eyes focusing on Veltar with something that might have been hope. "Explain," he said simply. Veltar activated his personal data display, showing a holographic representation of human history that made several delegates recoil in shock. The images showed conflicts spanning thousands of years, from primitive stick-and-stone warfare to nuclear devastation and beyond. What made it truly disturbing was not the violence itself, but the creativity and adaptability displayed in every conflict. In their brief recorded history, humans have fought over 12,000 documented wars, Veltar continued. They have weaponized everything from sharpened sticks to splitting atoms. They have turned farming tools into weapons, used weather as a tactical advantage, and repeatedly defeated larger and better-equipped enemies through methods that defy conventional military doctrine. Elder Moon Whisper's branches rustled with what sounded like nervous laughter. "You want us to ask for help from a species that has spent its entire existence fighting itself?" "Yes," Veltar replied without hesitation, "because they are still here. Despite their tendency toward conflict, despite their primitive technology, despite facing extinction-level events multiple times, they have not only survived, but thrived. They are the only species in our database that has never been successfully conquered or eliminated." The debate that followed lasted for several hours. Some delegates argued that humans were too primitive to be of any real assistance. Others worried that involving them would only add to the casualty count when the Vorthak inevitably defeated them as well. A few suggested that human military tactics might be so chaotic and unpredictable that they could actually make the situation worse. But as the holographic displays continued to show red markers advancing across the galaxy, eating up system after system with mechanical precision, the argument for desperate measures became harder to ignore. The mathematical projections were clear and terrifying. At the current rate of Vorthak expansion, every major civilization in the galaxy would be extinct or enslaved within 50 standard years. Zethkri finally called for a vote, his mandibles clicking with nervous energy. "All those in favor of making contact with the human species and requesting their assistance in our defense against the Vorthak Empire?" One by one, the hands, claws, tentacles, and various other appendages rose around the table. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive. The Galactic Council, in its wisdom and desperation, had just voted to place their hopes for survival in the hands of a species that had barely learned to leave its own star system. As the session ended and delegates began filing out to their respective ships, Veltar remained behind, staring at the tactical displays. He could not help but wonder if they had just made the best decision in galactic history or signed their own death warrant. Either way, there was no turning back now. The message would be sent to Earth within the day, and the Council would learn whether humanity's reputation for impossible victories was deserved or simply the product of primitive luck. Captain Jake Morrison was finishing his third cup of coffee when the impossible happened. His patrol ship, the UES Liberty, had been cruising the outer edge of the Sol system for 6 hours without seeing anything more interesting than a few mining, drones, and some space debris. The morning watch was usually quiet, which gave Morrison time to catch up on reports and wonder why Earth Defense Force Command insisted on sending patrols to the middle of nowhere. The alert klaxon shattered the peaceful silence like a hammer through glass. Morrison nearly dropped his coffee as his tactical officer, Lieutenant Ben Foster, spun around from his console with wide eyes and a face that had gone completely pale. "Captain, we have an unknown contact appearing on our sensors," Foster announced, his voice cracking slightly with excitement and fear. "It just materialized out of nowhere about 50,000 kilometers off our starboard bow." Morrison set down his coffee and moved to the main display screen, watching as the sensors painted a picture of something that should not exist. The ship that hung in space before them was sleek and organic-looking, its hull seeming to flow like liquid metal in the starlight. It was easily 3 times the size of the Liberty and covered in patterns that hurt to look at directly. Any response to our hails? Morrison asked, though he knew the answer before Foster shook his head. Earth had been broadcasting into space for over a century, but this was the first time anything had broadcast back. The communication came through their speakers in a voice that sounded like it was being filtered through water and static. The words were English, but the accent was unlike anything Morrison had ever heard. It was as if someone had learned the language by reading books, but had never heard it spoken aloud. "Captain Morrison of the Earth vessel Liberty," the voice said, each word carefully pronounced. "I am Ambassador Zethkri of the Galactic Council. We come seeking an alliance against a threat that endangers all sentient life in this galaxy." Morrison felt his world shift beneath his feet. In the space of a single sentence, humanity had gone from being alone in the universe to being invited to join something called the Galactic Council. He looked around his bridge at the stunned faces of his crew and realized that none of their training had prepared them for this moment. "This is Captain Morrison," he replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. "We welcome you to our system, Ambassador. What kind of threat are we talking about?" The answer came in the form of an invitation to board the alien vessel. Within 2 hours, Morrison found himself stepping through an airlock into a corridor that defied every law of physics he thought he understood. The walls curved in directions that made his eyes water, and the gravity seemed to shift depending on which way he was facing. Ambassador Zethkri was waiting for him in what could only be described as a conference room, though the furniture seemed to be grown rather than built. The ambassador himself was a mixture of insect and nightmare, standing on 4 legs that ended in sharp claws, with compound eyes that reflected Morrison's image in hundreds of tiny fragments. "Please sit," Zethkri said, gesturing with one of his clawed hands toward a chair that molded itself to Morrison's body as he settled into it. "What I am about to tell you will sound like something from your science fiction stories, but I assure you it is quite real." The story that followed made Morrison question his own sanity. According to Zethkri, the galaxy was home to dozens of intelligent species, all united under something called the Galactic Council. For thousands of years, they had maintained peace and prosperity through advanced technology and careful diplomacy. But now they faced an enemy that threatened to destroy everything they had built. "The Vorthak Empire," Zethkri explained, activating a holographic display that showed star maps and battle footage. "They appeared from beyond our borders 5 years ago and have been systematically conquering every system they encounter. Their technology is superior to ours, their tactics are flawless, and they show no interest in negotiation or surrender." Morrison watched the holographic images with growing horror. The Vorthak ships were massive geometric nightmares that moved with mechanical precision. Their battles were not chaotic affairs like human warfare, but carefully orchestrated dances of destruction that left nothing but debris in their wake. "Why come to us?" Morrison asked. "We have barely figured out how to leave our own solar system. Our weapons are primitive compared to what I am seeing here." Zethkri's mandibles clicked in what Morrison would later learn was the equivalent of a nervous laugh. "Because, Captain Morrison, in all our advanced civilizations, we have forgotten something that humans have never lost. We have forgotten how to fight a war that cannot be won through conventional means." The explanation that followed introduced Morrison to concepts that would reshape human understanding of interstellar politics. The various species of the Galactic Council had evolved beyond the need for large-scale warfare. Their conflicts were settled through negotiation, economic pressure, or carefully limited engagements that followed strict rules of conduct. They fought like gentlemen playing chess, following established patterns and accepted strategies. "But the Vorthak do not follow our rules," Zethkri continued. "They fight to win at any cost, using methods that our computers classify as inefficient or irrational. We need someone who understands that kind of warfare, someone who has experience fighting battles that should not be won." Morrison spent the next several hours reviewing tactical data that made his head spin. The Vorthak used formations and strategies that were mathematically perfect, but they also seemed incapable of adapting when faced with something unexpected. Every battle followed the same pattern. Overwhelming force applied with surgical precision until the enemy surrendered or was destroyed. "They fight like a computer program," Morrison muttered, studying the battle recordings for the dozenth time. Everything calculated, everything optimized for maximum efficiency. "Exactly," Zethkri agreed, "which is why we need someone who fights like a human." The meeting was interrupted by the arrival of two more Earth vessels, alerted by Morrison's emergency beacon. Colonel Lisa Hayes arrived aboard a military transport, along with Dr. Peter Kane, a xenobiologist who had been pulled from his research to serve as humanity's first contact specialist. Hayes was a small woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She spent 20 minutes reviewing the tactical data before making an observation that would prove prophetic. "They are too predictable," she said, pointing at the holographic displays. "Look at these formations, these attack patterns. They follow the same basic structure in every engagement." Dr. Kane was more interested in the aliens themselves. He peppered Zethkri with questions about council biology, technology, and social structures, taking notes on a tablet that seemed primitive compared to the alien equipment around them. "The council species have been at peace for so long that they have lost the ability to think like warriors," Kane observed during a private conversation with Morrison and Hayes. "They fight with their minds, calculating optimal outcomes and minimizing losses. But sometimes the optimal strategy is to charge into certain death because it is the last thing your enemy expects." As the day wore on, more Earth vessels arrived at the meeting point. Admiral Susan Blake brought a small fleet of patrol ships and destroyers, while Captain Maria Santos arrived with a convoy of civilian vessels that happened to be in the area. The sight of human ships surrounding the alien vessels seemed to make Zethkri nervous, though Morrison could not tell if it was fear or excitement. The final decision came after a long discussion between the human commanders. They could retreat to Earth and hope the Vorthak never found them, or they could join a galactic war against an enemy that had never been defeated. It was Hayes who put it into perspective. "We are already at war," she said simply. "We just do not know it yet. If the Council falls, how long do you think it will be before the Vorthak find Earth? At least this way we get to choose the battlefield." Morrison looked around at his fellow humans and saw the same determination in their eyes that had carried their species through countless impossible wars. They were scared, outgunned, and facing an enemy they barely understood. But they were ready to fight anyway. "Ambassador Zethkri," Morrison said formally, "humanity accepts your invitation to join the Galactic Council." 3 months had passed since humanity joined the Galactic Council, and Admiral Susan Blake stood in a war room that made Earth's most advanced command centers look like children's toys. The holographic displays surrounding her showed real-time, tactical information from across the galaxy, tracking the movements of hundreds of ships and thousands of smaller vessels. But what impressed her most was not the technology, but the faces of the alien commanders who were about to place their trust in a species they barely understood. Blake was a veteran of 3 different Earth conflicts, a woman who had earned her stars through careful planning and bold execution. She had gray hair that she kept pulled back in a regulation bun, and scars on her hands from the time she had manually repaired a ship's controls during a boarding action. Now she found herself surrounded by beings that looked like they had stepped out of humanity's strangest dreams and nightmares. Commander Rick Torres stood at her side, his tablet filled with notes and diagrams that represented weeks of studying Vorthak battle footage. Torres was Blake's tactical officer, a man who could look at any military situation and find 3 different ways to win and 5 different ways to lose. His dark eyes moved constantly between the displays and the assembled alien commanders, calculating odds and possibilities. "The Vorthak have won every engagement for the past 5 years," Blake began, her voice carrying easily through the translation devices worn by every delegate in the room. They have never retreated, never been surprised, and never been defeated. But they have also never faced an enemy that fights the way humans fight. Ambassador Zethkree clicked his mandibles nervously as he watched the human admiral manipulate the holographic displays with casual confidence. His compound eyes reflected the tactical projections that Blake was creating, showing attack patterns and formations that made no sense according to accepted military doctrine. "Explain your strategy," Admiral Corthan demanded, his 6 arms crossed in what his species considered a gesture of skeptical attention. The Rigelian warrior had lost entire fleets to the Vorthak and was not impressed by human confidence alone. Blake smiled in a way that would have made her enemies back on Earth very nervous. "The Vorthak fight like a computer program," she said, highlighting sections of the battle recordings that Torres had analyzed. "Every decision is based on mathematical calculations of optimal outcomes. Every strategy is designed for maximum efficiency with minimum loss. They are predictable because they are perfect." She paused to let that sink in before continuing. "But perfection is also a weakness. When you always choose the optimal strategy, your enemies learn to predict your moves. The Vorthak have been so successful because every species they have faced fights the same way they do, with logic and efficiency." Torres stepped forward and activated his own displays, showing human military history that made several of the alien commanders shift uncomfortably in their seats. The images showed conflicts where smaller forces had defeated larger ones through methods that seemed to defy common sense. "Humans have a concept we call asymmetric warfare," Torres explained. "When you cannot match your enemy's strength, you change the rules of the game. You fight in ways they do not expect, using weapons they do not recognize as weapons, in places they do not think to defend." The plan that Blake presented was so audacious that several delegates thought it was a joke. Human forces would attack, the Vorthak using 2 separate strategies that seemed designed to contradict each other. The first would be a conventional assault, using council technology and standard military doctrine. Exactly what the Vorthak would expect from any advanced civilization. "We will lead with our newest ships," Blake continued, highlighting formations of human vessels that had been retrofitted with alien technology. "These ships will broadcast challenge signals and approach in standard attack formations. They will follow accepted rules of engagement and use tactics that the Vorthak can analyze and counter." Captain Maria Santos listened from her position. Near the back of the room, her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she studied the tactical displays. Santos was a civilian, the commander of a mining vessel who had been pulled into military service because of her experience navigating asteroid fields and dangerous space. She represented the second part of Blake's plan, the part that made the alien commanders question human sanity. "While the Vorthak are focused on our military vessels, we will hit them with something they have never seen before," Blake announced, causing the displays to show a collection of ships that made the assembled aliens gasp in disbelief. "Civilian vessels, mining ships, exploration craft, and cargo haulers will conduct the real attack." Elder Moonwhisper swayed her massive trunk in what her species called the gesture of deep confusion. "You want to attack their fortress with mining equipment and passenger transports?" "That is exactly what we want to do," Santos said, speaking for the first time since the briefing began. "Because that is the last thing they will expect. Their computers will classify our ships as non-threatening until we are close enough to make their perfect defenses useless." The technical details of the plan revealed just how creative human thinking could be when faced with impossible odds. Mining charges designed to break apart asteroids would be used against shield generators. Industrial cutting lasers meant for salvage operations would target structural weak points in enemy hulls. Even the navigation systems of exploration vessels would be turned into weapons by using them to identify vulnerabilities that military scanners were not designed to find. Dr. Peter Kane had spent weeks studying Council technology and Vorthak equipment, looking for ways to combine human creativity with alien science. His research had revealed something that surprised even him. The more advanced a civilization became, the more specialized their tools became, and the less likely they were to think of alternative uses for those tools. The Vorthak build their ships to withstand military weapons, Kane explained to the assembled commanders. Their shields are designed to deflect plasma cannons and quantum torpedoes. But they have never faced mining charges detonated at point-blank range or industrial cutting beams focused on structural joints. The debate that followed was intense and sometimes heated. Several alien commanders argued that the plan was too risky, that sending civilian vessels against military targets was both dangerous and unethical. Others worried that human unpredictability might work against them as much as for them. But Admiral Corthan, who had lost more ships to the Vorthak than any other commander, surprised everyone by supporting the human strategy. "I have watched perfect tactics fail against this enemy for 5 years," he said, his voice carrying the weight of countless defeats. "Perhaps it is time to try imperfect tactics." The final element of Blake's plan was the most dangerous and the most important. Captain Jake Morrison would lead a small group of volunteers in a direct assault on the Vorthak command ship, using nothing but standard human equipment and tactics that predated spaceflight by centuries. "You want to board their flagship with soldiers carrying projectile weapons?" Counselor Veltar asked, his blue scales shifting to colors that indicated extreme skepticism. Morrison nodded calmly. "Vorthak ships are designed to repel energy weapons and prevent teleportation. But they have never faced enemies who would use explosive charges to blow holes in their hulls and then climb through those holes with nothing but rifles and determination." Blake watched the alien faces as they struggled to understand human military thinking. To beings who had fought wars with computer-guided precision for thousands of years, the idea of deliberately choosing chaos over order was almost incomprehensible. "The Vorthak strength is their predictability," she said in conclusion. "They always know what their enemies will do because their enemies always choose the logical strategy. But humans do not always choose the logical strategy. Sometimes we choose the winning strategy instead." The vote to approve the human battle plan was closer than Blake had hoped, but it passed by a narrow margin. As the alien commanders filed out to prepare their forces, Torres approached his admiral with a question that had been bothering him since the briefing began. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked quietly. Blake looked at the tactical displays showing Vorthak forces advancing steadily across the galaxy and smiled grimly. "I think it is the only chance we have got. And sometimes, when you are facing impossible odds, the only rational choice is to do something completely irrational." The preparations began immediately, with human and alien engineers working together to retrofit civilian vessels for combat and train council forces in the art of controlled chaos that humans called warfare. The galaxy was about to learn whether humanity's reputation for impossible victories was deserved. The Kepler system had become the focal point of galactic history, though none of the beings fighting there realized it yet. Admiral Susan Blake stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching as hundreds of ships prepared for a battle that would either save the galaxy or witness its final defeat. The Vorthak had established their forward command base in this system 6 months ago, turning it into an impregnable fortress that had withstood every assault the Council could mount. Blake checked her chronometer and opened a channel to the fleet. Her voice carried across dozens of ships as human and alien crews made their final preparations for what everyone knew would be the most important battle of their lives. The plan was in motion, and there would be no turning back now. "All units, this is Admiral Blake," she announced, her words being translated into a dozen different languages for the benefit of the Council forces under her command. "Remember, we are not trying to win this battle through superior firepower. We are trying to win it by making the enemy forget how to fight." Captain Jake Morrison acknowledged the transmission from his position aboard the UES Liberty, which now flew alongside vessels from across the galaxy. His ship had been retrofitted with Council technology, but Morrison had insisted on keeping the human weapons systems as backup. Something told him that before this battle was over, he would need every advantage he could get. "Admiral, we are detecting Vorthak fleet movements," reported Commander Rick Torres from his position at the tactical station. "They are deploying in Standard Formation 7 exactly as predicted." Blake nodded grimly. The Vorthak response was so predictable that Torres had been able to forecast their movements down to the minute. Their massive dreadnoughts moved with mechanical precision, taking positions that would maximize their firepower while minimizing their exposure to enemy attack. It was textbook perfect, which was exactly what Blake had been counting on. "Phase 1 is a go," Blake announced. "All military vessels begin standard approach. Make them think we are just another Council fleet trying the same old tactics." The first wave of ships moved forward in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming with fresh Council technology and their weapons charging with energies that could shatter planets. To any observer, it looked like exactly the kind of assault that the Vorthak had defeated hundreds of times before. The enemy computers would analyze their approach, calculate optimal countermeasures, and prepare to destroy them with ruthless efficiency. Meanwhile, Captain Maria Santos guided her mining ship through the asteroid field that surrounded the outer edge of the Kepler system. Behind her came 30 other vessels that no military planner would ever consider suitable for combat. There were exploration ships designed to map unknown systems, cargo haulers built to carry supplies across interstellar distances, and even a luxury yacht that had been volunteered by its owner for the cause. Santos had spent her entire career navigating dangerous space, threading her ship through asteroid fields and debris clouds that would have destroyed military vessels. Now she used those same skills to approach the Vorthak fortress without being detected, hiding her convoy among the floating rocks and metal fragments that littered the system. "Mining crew to all civilian vessels," Santos transmitted on a frequency that the Vorthak would dismiss as industrial chatter. "Begin approach to designated work sites. Remember, we are just here to collect some rocks." Lieutenant Ben Foster piloted his converted exploration vessel with the same careful precision he had once used to map unknown star systems. His ship's geological survey equipment painted detailed pictures of the Vorthak station's structure, revealing weak points and vulnerabilities that military scanners had never been designed to detect. "I am reading stress fractures in their outer hull," Foster reported quietly. "Looks like their shield generators are creating harmonic vibrations that they do not know about. If we hit those points with industrial cutting beams, we might be able to cascade their entire defense grid." The Vorthak command ship hung in space like a geometric nightmare, its crystalline hull reflecting starlight in patterns that hurt human eyes to look at directly. Inside that ship, Admiral Kethmore of the Vorthak fleet watched the approaching Council forces with the cold satisfaction of a predator that had cornered its prey. "Analysis complete," reported his tactical officer in the synthesized voice that all Vorthak used for official communications. "Enemy fleet composition matches Standard Council Formation 12. Recommended response is Annihilation Pattern 5. Kethmore nodded his approval and watched as his fleet moved to implement the pattern that had destroyed every enemy they had ever faced. The Vorthak ships flowed through space like a school of mechanical fish, each vessel taking its assigned position with mathematical precision, their weapons charged to optimal levels and their shields calibrated to deflect the specific types of energy weapons that Council forces typically used. "Commence primary assault," Kethmore ordered, and the space around the Kepler system erupted into a light show that could be seen from neighboring star systems. The battle began exactly as every previous engagement had begun, with Vorthak forces demonstrating their technological superiority through overwhelming displays of firepower. Council ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light as quantum torpedoes found their targets with perfect accuracy. Energy beams capable of cutting through asteroid belts carved through hulls like they were made of paper. But Blake had not sent her ships to win this part of the battle. She had sent them to make the Vorthak overconfident and to focus their attention on the obvious threat while ignoring the one they could not see coming. "Phase 2, execute," Blake ordered, and Santos led her civilian convoy out of the asteroid field like a pack of wolves emerging from the forest. The first indication that something was wrong came when Santos's mining ship launched a spread of industrial charges directly at the Vorthak station's shield generators. The explosives had been designed to break apart asteroids, not to penetrate military shields, but they had been modified with Council technology in ways that no Vorthak computer could have predicted. The mining charges detonated in a chain reaction that cascaded through the station's defense grid like dominoes falling in sequence. Shield generators overloaded and exploded, creating gaps in the defensive network that had never existed in any Vorthak tactical simulation. "What is happening?" Kethmore demanded, watching his displays show system failures that should have been impossible. "Those are not military vessels. Why are civilian ships attacking our installation?" His tactical officer's synthesized voice carried the first hints of confusion that any Vorthak had expressed in over a century of warfare. "Unknown attack pattern. No data available for optimal response. Recommend immediate analysis and recalculation." But there was no time for analysis. Foster's exploration ship used its geological survey equipment to map the exact stress points in the Vorthak hull, then fired industrial cutting beams with surgical precision. The beams were not designed as weapons, but they were perfect for cutting through the specific types of metal and crystal that the Vorthak used in their construction. A luxury yacht piloted by an elderly human named George Adams rammed directly into a Vorthak destroyer, its passenger compartments packed with explosives instead of tourists. The destroyer's shields were calibrated to stop energy weapons and deflect projectiles, but they had never been tested against a ship that was being used as a guided missile. "Civilian vessels are not conforming to acceptable tactical parameters," the Vorthak tactical officer reported, panic beginning to creep into his artificial voice. "Their attack patterns match no known military doctrine. Request immediate withdrawal for analysis and recalibration." But Santos was not finished. Her mining ship used its industrial equipment to grapple onto the Vorthak command station and began tearing through its hull with cutting beams that had been designed to slice apart asteroid cores. Behind her, cargo haulers used their loading equipment to grab pieces of the station and hurl them at nearby enemy ships. The Vorthak fleet, faced with an enemy that fought like no military force they had ever encountered, began to lose the perfect coordination that had made them invincible. Their computers could not process mining equipment being used as weapons, or cargo ships ramming into battle cruisers, or exploration vessels using scientific instruments to target structural weak points. "Admiral, the enemy fleet is breaking formation," Torres reported with barely contained excitement. "Their response times are increasing and their coordination is falling apart." Blake watched as the Vorthak ships began to scatter, their perfect tactical formation dissolving into chaos as their computers struggled to analyze threats that matched no known patterns. It was time for the final phase of her plan. "Jake Morrison, you are clear for boarding action," she announced. "Take that. Command ship and show them what humans do when we get really angry." Captain Jake Morrison attached the last explosive charge to the Vorthak command ship's hull and stepped back to admire his work. The alien metal was tougher than anything Earth had ever produced, but human engineering had found a way to cut through it using nothing more sophisticated than shaped charges and determination. Around him, his boarding team prepared for an assault that would have been called suicide by any reasonable military standard. "Remember, these are not energy weapons," Morrison told his team as they checked their equipment one final time. "The Vorthak have never faced projectile weapons or chemical explosives. Their personal shields are designed to stop plasma bolts and particle beams, not bullets and grenades." Sergeant Lisa Park nodded as she loaded her rifle with ammunition that had been manufactured on Earth using techniques that were thousands of years old. The bullets were simple pieces of metal designed to punch holes in things, but sometimes the simplest solutions were the most effective ones. The explosion that tore through the Vorthak hull sounded like thunder in the vacuum of space, transmitted through the ship's structure to every compartment and corridor. Morrison led his team through the breach with the same aggressive tactics that human soldiers had been using since they first learned to fight wars. Inside the Vorthak command ship, Admiral Kethmore watched his tactical displays with growing horror as his perfect fleet fell apart around him. The civilian vessels had done more damage in 30 minutes than the Council's military forces had managed in 5 years of warfare. His computers were still trying to analyze attack patterns that made no sense according to any known military doctrine. "Sir, we have borders," reported his security chief in a voice that carried the first notes of panic that any Vorthak had felt in decades. "They have breached the outer hull using primitive explosive devices." Kethmore turned to stare at his subordinate with eyes that reflected the cold light of his ship's crystalline walls. "Borders? No enemy has attempted to board a Vorthak vessel in over 2 centuries. Our defensive systems will eliminate them within minutes." But the defensive systems had never been designed to stop enemies who fought with such primitive brutality. Morrison's team moved through the ship's corridors like a force of nature, using grenades to clear rooms and rifle fire to disable equipment that had never been tested against projectile weapons. The Vorthak soldiers they encountered were perfectly trained and equipped with weapons that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level. But their energy shields were useless against bullets, and their tactical computers could not calculate optimal responses to enemies who seemed to ignore all rules of civilized warfare. They are using chemical propellants to launch metal projectiles. One Vorthak soldier reported before Morrison's team silenced his position with a combination of explosive charges and automatic weapons fire. No defense protocols available for this type of attack. Outside the command ship, Captain Maria Santos guided her mining vessel through the wreckage of what had once been the most powerful fleet in the galaxy. Vorthak ships drifted in space with their hulls torn open and their perfect formations scattered, like leaves in a hurricane. Her civilian convoy had turned the battle into exactly the kind of chaotic mess that humans excelled at winning. "All civilian vessels continue harassment patterns," Santos announced over the communication network that connected her improvised fleet. "Do not let them regroup or establish new formations. Keep hitting them with everything we have got." The luxury yacht piloted by George Adams had survived its ramming attack and was now using its entertainment systems to broadcast human music at frequencies that interfered with Vorthak communication networks. Somewhere in the chaos, a cargo hauler was using its loading equipment to grab Vorthak fighters and throw them into larger ships like a child playing with toys. Lieutenant Ben Foster's exploration vessel had attached itself to a Vorthak cruiser and was systematically dismantling it using industrial cutting equipment. His geological survey instruments had identified every weak point in the enemy ship's structure, and he was exploiting them with the methodical precision of a demolition. Expert Admiral Susan Blake watched the battle from her command ship and felt something she had not experienced in years of military service. For the first time since the Vorthak had appeared, a council fleet was winning a major engagement. But more than that, they were winning it using methods that would reshape galactic warfare forever. "Admiral, the Vorthak fleet is attempting to retreat," reported Commander Rick Torres with barely contained excitement. "Their formation has completely collapsed, and they are falling back toward the edge of the system." Blake opened a channel to all council forces and spoke words that would be remembered for centuries. "Let them go," she said, "but make sure they remember what happened here. Make sure they understand that the galaxy is no longer afraid of them." Inside the Vorthak command ship, Morrison kicked down the door to the bridge and found himself face to face with Admiral Kethmore. The alien commander was tall and angular, with skin that looked like polished metal and eyes that reflected light, like mirrors. He stood perfectly still as Morrison's team secured the bridge, his expression showing the kind of confusion that came from watching everything you believed proven wrong. "You fight without honor," Kethmore said, speaking in accented English that his translation devices had learned from intercepted human communications. "Your tactics are inefficient and your methods are primitive." Morrison lowered his rifle and looked at the alien admiral with something that might have been pity. "You are right," he said simply. "We do fight without honor when we have to. We use inefficient tactics when efficient ones do not work. And we stay primitive enough to remember that the goal is not to fight perfectly, but to win." The surrender that followed was unlike anything in galactic history. The Vorthak Empire, which had never lost a battle or retreated from an enemy, formally requested terms from a species they had dismissed as primitive only hours before. Their perfect military machine had been broken by mining equipment, cargo, ships, and soldiers with rifles. Dr. Peter Kane arrived at the Kepler system aboard a Council diplomatic vessel to help negotiate the surrender terms. What he found was a Vorthak leadership that seemed fundamentally broken by their defeat. They had built their entire civilization around the concept of perfect warfare, and humanity had proven that perfection was not enough. "They cannot understand how they lost," Kane reported to the Council during the peace negotiations. "Their computers are still trying to analyze our tactics, but they keep reaching the same conclusion: our methods should not have worked." The aftermath of the Battle of Kepler's Gate sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy that would take decades to fully understand. The Vorthak Empire, faced with an enemy they could not predict or counter, agreed to withdraw from all occupied territories and enter into peace negotiations with the Galactic Council. But perhaps more importantly, the other species of the galaxy began to understand something about humans that would reshape interstellar relations forever. Ambassador Zethkri put it best during his report to the Council Assembly. "We invited humanity to join us because we were desperate," he said, his mandibles clicking with what humans had learned was amusement. "We thought we were asking them to help us fight a war. What we did not realize is that we were asking them to teach us how to fight." The Galactic Council offered humanity full membership and access to all their advanced technologies. Human military advisors were assigned to every council fleet, and the Asymmetric Warfare Institute became the most prestigious military academy in the galaxy. Colonel Lisa Hayes, promoted to general and appointed as humanity's military liaison to the council, established training programs that taught alien species how to think like humans when facing impossible odds. For the first time in galactic history, advanced civilizations were learning warfare from a species they had once considered primitive. Captain Maria Santos returned to her mining ship, but now she carried the title of Admiral of the Civilian Defense Corps, a new branch of Council forces dedicated to turning ordinary vessels into instruments of war when necessary. Her tactics manual became required reading at military academies across the galaxy. The Vorthak threat was ended not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by humanity's greatest strength: the ability to adapt, improvise, and turn any situation into an opportunity for victory. The Council's last hope had been humanity, and in the end, it had been more than enough to save the galaxy from its darkest hour.